What if MKUltra was real? On the morning of the 13th of April, 1953, Alan Welsh Dulles signed a one-page memo at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. The memo authorized a top-secret research program into the use of biological and chemical agents to control human behavior. The program it created would run for 20 years. At least 80 institutions would eventually be involved. Researchers would spin up more than 150 separate sub-projects. Congress would never vote on the program. The public would never hear its name. The program was called MKUltra. The MK stood for the CIA's Technical Services Staff. Ultra was the classification level reserved for the most sensitive, compartmented work in American intelligence. Dulles had been Director of Central Intelligence for only 2 months. He had been appointed by President Eisenhower in February 1953, after the CIA's catastrophic failure to predict the Soviet atomic test the previous August. Dulles believed, correctly, that the United States was behind the Soviets in the most dangerous kind of science, the science of breaking human beings. He was not about to lose that race. MKUltra was the United States answer. The answer, Dulles wrote in a separate internal note, was to be pursued. Sidney Gottlieb was not the kind of man you would expect to run a mind control program. Gottlieb had a doctorate in chemistry from the California Institute of Technology. He had worked at the USDA's Bureau of Animal Industry during the war, studying animal diseases. He had joined the CIA in 1951 as a low-level chemist. By 1953, he was running the most sensitive behavioral research program in the world. Gottlieb was a quiet, soft-spoken man who raised goats on a small farm in Virginia. He drove a Volvo. He liked to joke with junior officers. He was also, by every account, the most active experimenter in the MKUltra program. Gottlieb personally supervised LSD administrations on unwitting American citizens. He personally drugged his own staff at CIA retreats to test the compound's effect. He personally approved the budget for Operation Midnight Climax, the San Francisco safe house operation in which CIA contractors paid prostitutes to lure men back to a soundproofed room and dose them with LSD without their knowledge. Gottlieb ran MKUltra for 20 years. He retired in 1972, a year before the program was officially terminated. In January 1977, when a wave of Freedom of Information Act lawsuits was about to make the program's existence public, Gottlieb ordered his assistant to destroy every MKUltra file he could find at CIA headquarters. The assistant spent the weekend feeding documents into the furnace in the basement. Most of MKUltra's paper trail went up in smoke. In 1955, the CIA opened a safe house in the Marina District of San Francisco. The cover was a bordello. The actual purpose was behavioral experimentation on unwitting American men. The operation was called Midnight Climax. A CIA officer named Richard Helms, the same Richard Helms who would later become Director of Central Intelligence, helped establish the program. A Navy officer turned CIA contractor named George Hunter White ran the day-to-day operations. White hired 2 San Francisco prostitutes and armed them with LSD. The women carried cigarettes spiked with the drug, and they slipped LSD into drinks whenever the moment allowed. White then sent the women to bars in the Marina and North Beach to pick up clients. When the men brought the women back to the safe house on Broadway, White dosed the men's drinks with LSD from a hidden dispenser. The men would then sit on a couch, often in their underwear, and talk. A two-way mirror in the wall let White and his CIA colleagues watch from the next room. A hidden microphone recorded everything. None of the men were told what had been put into their drinks. None of them were paid. Consent was never requested of any of them. A number of the men were CIA employees, sent over to test the operational technique. Other men were active-duty military officers, pulled in as a convenient pool of subjects. Still others were ordinary civilians who had picked up the wrong woman at the wrong bar. Midnight Climax ran for at least 8 years. The number of men drugged is not known because most of the records were destroyed. The estimates range from several dozen to several hundred. The San Francisco operation was eventually joined by a second safe house in New York. The New York operation, run by a different CIA officer, used similar methods. The operations were not technically illegal at the time. The men were not in custody. They had not been arrested. They had no connection to the military. They were, by any reasonable standard, ordinary American citizens who had been dosed with a powerful hallucinogen without their knowledge, while CIA officers watched them through a mirror. In 1957, the CIA began funding a psychiatrist in Montreal named Donald Ewen Cameron. Cameron was not a fringe figure. By then, he had already founded the World Psychiatric Association and served as its first president. He held a chair at McGill University, one of the most respected medical schools in Canada. He was, by every professional measure, a leading figure in 20th century psychiatry. The CIA gave Cameron $69,000 over 4 years. In return, Cameron agreed to apply techniques the CIA had developed under a related program called Artichoke. The technique was called psychic driving. Patients were put into a drug-induced sleep for periods of up to 3 months. While unconscious, they were played looped tape recordings, sometimes for 16 to 20 hours a day. The recordings contained the same phrase or the same word, repeated thousands of times. When the patients were brought out of the sleep, they were subjected to high-voltage electroshock, sometimes dozens of times a day, to break down their existing mental patterns. The goal, in Cameron's own notes, was to depattern the patients and rebuild their personalities from scratch. None of the patients were CIA prisoners. None of them were Soviet spies. The patients were ordinary Canadians, mostly women, who had come to Cameron's clinic for help with anxiety, depression, or postpartum distress. They received no warning about what was being done to them. They were not asked for consent. They were not informed of the funding source. At least 11 of Cameron's patients emerged from the treatment with permanent brain damage. Several spent the rest of their lives in psychiatric institutions. The CIA paid the bills. The Canadian government later paid out compensation in the 1990s. Cameron died in 1967. He never faced a criminal charge. Frank Olson was a bacteriologist. He worked for the Army's Biological Warfare Research Program at Fort Detrick, Maryland. In November 1953, he attended a small CIA conference at a remote location in Maryland. The conference was about MKUltra. On the 19th of November, 1953, Sidney Gottlieb poured a dose of LSD into Olson's after-dinner Cointreau. Olson did not know. Olson was not asked. 9 days later, on November 28, Olson checked into room 1018A of the Hotel Statler in New York City. The room was on the 10th floor. Early in the morning, Olson walked through the room's window and fell 13 stories to the alley below. He died on the pavement. The death was ruled a suicide. The body was cremated within 48 hours. For the next 2 decades, the Olson family was given no hint that anything unusual had preceded Frank's death. They did not know about the LSD. They had not been told about the meeting in Maryland. They were unaware of the cover-up that had already begun. In 1975, after the Church Committee exposed MKUltra, the White House contacted the Olson family. President Gerald Ford met with the family in the Oval Office. Ford apologized on behalf of the United States government. The family received a $750,000 settlement. The official position of the United States government is that Olson's death was a suicide triggered by the LSD. Several independent investigations, including one by a 2012 New York Times reporter who obtained the original 1,953 autopsy report, have raised serious questions about the suicide finding. The original medical examiner who signed the death certificate, was not told about the LSD. The body was destroyed before a second autopsy could be performed. Olson's family was not told about any of this for 22 years. In 1955, the U.S. Army began a series of chemical and biological agent tests at the Edgewood Arsenal, a 37,000-acre facility in eastern Maryland. The tests would run for 20 years. The subjects were American soldiers. The soldiers were not told what they were being given. They were not told how the compounds would affect them. They signed consent forms, but the consent forms did not name the compounds. The compounds tested at Edgewood included LSD, the hallucinogen BZ, the dissociative PCP, and at least 250 other chemical and biological agents, many of them classified. Certain soldiers were given combinations of compounds to test how the agents interacted. Others were given single compounds at doses high enough to cause hospitalization. A small number of the soldiers were followed for years afterward. Most of the soldiers were not. The official purpose of the program was to develop defensive measures against enemy use of chemical and biological weapons. The actual practice was that thousands of American soldiers were used as test subjects, often without their knowledge, often without adequate follow-up, sometimes with permanent effects. In 1976, after the Church Committee hearings, the Army acknowledged the program. The Army issued a public report. The Army apologized. None of the soldiers were named in the report. None of them received compensation. The long-term health outcomes of the men were not tracked. Most of the soldiers had to find out on their own that they had been part of the program. A number of them are still alive, and a handful have filed lawsuits. A few have been told by the Army that the records of their specific tests have been lost. In January 1975, Senator Frank Church of Idaho convened the United States Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities. The committee was a direct response to the Watergate scandal, the CIA's domestic spying revelations, and the public's growing distrust of American intelligence. The committee's first public hearings were held in September 1975. The committee took testimony from former CIA officers, former military officers, former intelligence officials, and former government scientists. The committee's investigators had found, in boxes of records the CIA had failed to destroy, the names of MKUltra sub-projects, the names of universities and hospitals that had taken CIA funding, and the names of researchers who had been paid to experiment on unwitting American and Canadian citizens. The committee's chief counsel was a young man named F.A.O. Schwartz, Jr. The committee's chief investigator was a man named John Elliff. The committee's most famous witness was Richard Helms, the former director of Central Intelligence, who had run MKUltra from inside the CIA's Operations Directorate in the 1960s. Helms had been asked about MKUltra during his confirmation hearings as ambassador to Iran in 1973. He had said nothing. Now, in 1975, with the committee's questions in writing and the documents in hand, Helms had to answer. The committee's report, published in November 1975, ran to several hundred pages. The MKUltra chapter ran to 28 pages. It described the use of unwitting subjects in clinical and non-clinical settings. It laid out the systematic destruction of files by the CIA. It named the universities, hospitals, prisons, and military units that had been involved. The committee was unable, in the time it had, to identify every institution. It was unable to name every researcher. It was unable to name every victim. The report did what it could, with what it had, in the time it had. The committee was disbanded in 1976. The Church Committee's investigation is the reason the American public knows the name MKUltra today. The 13th of April, 1953. Allen Dulles signs the MKUltra memo. The program is authorized. 20 years of experiments follow. Sidney Gottlieb runs the program. He drips LSD into the Cointreau of his own employees. He pays prostitutes to drug clients in San Francisco safe houses. He funds Donald Ewen Cameron in Montreal to depattern Canadian patients. He orders Frank Olson dosed without his knowledge. Olson falls from a hotel window 9 days later. The U.S. Army runs parallel tests on its own soldiers at Edgewood Arsenal for 20 years. The soldiers are not told. The victims are not warned. The records are not preserved. In 1975, the Church Committee drags the program into the daylight. Sidney Gottlieb, by then retired, is interviewed by a journalist. He says he wishes he had never heard of LSD. He is asked in writing whether the program had any medical benefit. He answers in writing that he cannot think of a single instance in which the program produced any useful result. The program produced no useful result. The program produced, instead, at least one dead American scientist, at least 11 permanently brain-damaged Canadian patients, and at least several hundred unwitting American citizens who were drugged without their consent. In January 1977, the CIA orders the remaining MKUltra files destroyed. The assistant spends the weekend feeding documents into the basement furnace. The most thorough mind control program in the history of the United States is, when the furnace is cold, a small pile of ash and a few boxes of records the destroyer missed. The official position of the United States government is that the program was wrong, that it ended in 1973, and that the people responsible have been held accountable. No one was ever prosecuted for MKUltra. No CIA officer was charged. No researcher was charged. No doctor was charged. No person who dosed an unwitting American citizen with LSD and watched them through a mirror was ever held to account. The program ran for 20 years. The people ran for 20 years. The victims ran for the rest of their lives. What you make of it is up to you. What if MKUltra was real?